Hi everyone, I'm Pari. Welcome to Living Your Best Life with Eddie Stone, founder and CEO of Touchstone Essentials. Hello, Eddie.
Hello, Perry. Hope you're
How are
doing
you?
well this morning.
I'm great. How
Yeah,
are
I'm good
you?
here. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
we're good. We're getting ready to head into our fall season here in
Uh-huh.
North Carolina, where I live, on the east coast of the U.S. And so we'll have some cooler weather and a little less humidity. And so it's one of my favorite times of the year. It just feels the air feels kind of cool and fresh. I don't know if you ever get a chance to have that season in Thailand, but it's pretty nice.
Here where I am, not really, but the weather today, this morning it looks like it's going like to be in the winter time, but here no winter.
Not really winter.
But it's great to see. I mean, a bit change. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Eddie. So today, what are we going to talk about?
Well, we're going to talk about a subject that we may get some hate mail. Okay, so I'm prepared about this because I'm going to talk about one of people's favorite subjects in the whole world, and that's bread.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like no matter where you go, people really like bread, and I like bread too. I don't want anybody to misconstrue the fact that I love all kinds of bread, and I just absolutely love it. And for centuries, we've sort of lived off bread, right? For decade upon decade, and particularly in poorer parts of the world, bread, rice, you could say, those are things that are sort of real substances that people sort of live off of. But bread has really changed a lot. And I don't know if you see that in Thailand, but I know a lot of places that I travel, people sort of recognize that maybe the bread they grew up with in their childhood that they got from a local bakery, maybe their mom or their grandmom or somebody, made bread for their household. The bread people have today is really quite different. And so that's our subject I thought we'd dive into, is really what's going on with bread.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Here, people eat a lot of bread too, Eddie. I
Yeah.
mean, I mean, every day people eat bread now in Thailand.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing. It's kind of the perfect comfort food, right? For people that maybe they eat sometimes emotionally or whatever. And it's also something that's just terrific on the go. So whether you're talking about bagels or you're talking about things like pizza or sandwich bread or even breadcrumbs that are used in cooking preparations, or things like French toast. I don't know if you have French toast. It's where you take the bread and kind of wet it in egg and then fry it up, and people will put powdered sugar and syrup and things on there. So bread is popular, but it's interesting about its reputation, because I think you and we've spoken before about the ketone diets and other low carb diets and paleo diets. I mean, there's all these diets out there. And so in some circles, bread is really quite villainized. But yet we got to recognize that it's one of the most popular foods on the planet. And that's because it can provide, under the right circumstances, it can provide nutrients. The challenge is, in the last 10, it depends on sort of the dates and times that you're looking at, maybe 15, 20 years, bread has really changed. And so it's gone from sort of this traditional kind of flat bread to these really super high gluten, fluffy breads that you would associate with fast rising doughs, pizzas, pastries, and things of this kind. And the biggest issues there are not just that perhaps the preparations have changed. Clearly, preparation methods have changed, but ingredients. And then really baking techniques themselves have changed. And so the dynamics around bread have changed. And so here's sort of the end results of that. For a lot of individuals, bread today is a recipe for gaining weight. It can really, if it's a heavy part of the diet, can contribute to metabolic disorders. And this is a situation where a person's body weight is going up. They're developing insulin resistance. They're developing type 2 diabetes. And so kind of one of the very first things that will happen in situations like that is their physician will say, hey, listen, how much bread are you eating? Can you start to eliminate starches from your diet? Which, understandable under those situations, but it has a lot to do with the type of bread that it is. And it can also, given the types of breads that are out there today, it can damage your gut. You know, we hear people talking about things like leaky gut. It can promote inflammation. So now we start talking about particularly inflammation that's blood-based inflammation. We're talking about increasing your risk of cardiovascular disease. And even in some cases, depending upon the type of bread somebody's eating, it can actually increase somebody's risk of cancer. And so somewhere along the way here, we got off track with a lot of the breads that we're eating. And it's only if you start to look back at some of the artisan breads and artisan the practices of baking bread that we kind of find out what's going on. So I've kind of got this sort of this list of things to sort of think about. And remember, Pari, for me, our shows that we do, I want to draw attention to an issue that somebody may be sabotaging their diet and not realize it, right? They've got all these wonderful health plans and they're not finding the improvements they want to. And so we want to bring awareness to those kinds of issues, but we also want to inform people about choices. So with bread, there are breads that can promote health, and there are breads that, unfortunately, a lot of commercial breads simply do not promote your health whatsoever. And so the way to think about this is that bread 15, 20, 25 years ago, oftentimes it would be a bread made of a stone ground flour. And so what that means is that flour would maintain some nutrients in it native to whatever wheat source that you are using. Oftentimes they were using yeast cultures to then cause that bread to rise and gain some texture and some fluffiness. And then, I mean, really it could be made with 4 or 5 ingredients. You could have your yeast cultures, your stone ground flour, salt, and warm water. I mean, that can be a recipe, particularly for flatbreads, right? And so that's what bread used to be. Now, today, though, if you go in some of these modern chain bakeries, grocery stores, here in the U.S., we had this proliferation of these sandwich shops called sub shops. And I don't know if you guys have sandwiches or you refer to them as sub sandwiches, but pretty large sandwiches that people buy, not sort of the traditional cut of bread. And a lot of times in those places, they're popular because they have this really great tasting bread. The reality is that bread is really devoid of a lot of nutrients and also can contain a lot of sugar. So sort of here's what happens today. Most commercial bread, large-scale production bread, it really resembles this ultra-processed food that we always talk about on the show as being something that you want to sort of limit the amount of calories in your diet coming from ultra-processed foods, because in the case of bread, for example, they're generally using blanched or bleached, I should say, flours. And so those super white flours, they're using bleaching agents to cause that to occur, but that's also then essentially eliminating a lot of the nutrients, particularly micronutrients that you might associate with flour. So again, one of the differences is this commercial production of flour, particularly flour that would have preservatives so it lasts for a very, very long time, which we sort of understand why the manufacturer would want that. But as opposed to something like a stone ground flour that actually has nutrients, not preservatives, and can't last forever, right? I mean, one of the things to think about is, will your food spoil after a reasonable period of time? And you actually want to see your food spoil after a reasonable period of time, because that means it's not sort of preserved or kept alive with these preservatives that aren't good for the body, particularly for the gut. And so the bleached flours is sort of one issue. The other is that oftentimes people don't realize how many sweeteners are generally used in the production of commercial bread. So when folks go into these sub shops often and they say, oh my gosh, this bread tastes so good, it's almost like dessert. Well, that's because it really is almost like dessert. If you dig into the labeling information, and sometimes you have to go to a company's website to see this, they'll have a lot of high fructose corn syrup in there, or oftentimes they'll have sucralose. And people sometimes will confuse sucralose as being a version of natural sugar. That's not the case. Sucralose means an artificial sweetener. And so just like high fructose corn syrup, it's so concentrated that the prolonged use of it will raise a person's risk of developing type 2 diabetes, which is the fastest growing form of diabetes we're having to deal with in the US and really in a lot of the developed world, right? So type 2 diabetes is a real critical issue, and coming from all the sweeteners used in things like your common bread. And then there are what are referred to as dough conditioners, right? And essentially these are chemicals that are manufactured to make dough stay in its doughy state longer without hardening, so it can be set aside before it's baked. It's you go into some of these chain pizza restaurants and you'll see stacks and stacks and stacks of tubs with dough in them that's just sort of waiting to be used, and it can actually sit there for days at the time because they're using these conditioners to maintain a softness, and then they're also waiting to then react it with another chemical, so actually the rising aspect of what the dough does can kick off and go into place. So it kind of puts it on a pause. Unfortunately, those are chemicals that are man-made chemicals that aren't good for people, right? And so you want to be leery of dough conditioners. And in fact, unfortunately in the US, potassium bromate, which is one of the most common, is actually still allowed to be used commercially in the US, yet a lot of countries have realized that as it is heated and changes its chemical composition during the baking process, there are some concerns about its raises the risk of cancer. And so there's a lot of things out there that the research would suggest we ought to have some caution and really think about these chemicals that we're introducing into the food supply. I mean, in total, when you start adding up sort of these dough conditioners and the sweeteners, these other things, you're talking about where traditional bread was made with 4 or 5 ingredients. You know, very often the bread you're buying in a grocery store can be 40 plus ingredients. I mean, you look on a loaf of bread and you look at that ingredient list and it looks like a chemical display, right? Something you might find on a package of motor oil or something like that. So it's concerning. Preservatives, BHA and, well, I guess BHA and BHT are really the most concerning of the preservatives that are out there. Again, these are things that are allowed in the U.S. A lot of countries have banned them because of their potential risk associated with cancer. But the bottom line is, for consumers, we can be better shoppers by just paying attention to some of these ingredients and just sort of recognizing. And I'm not saying eating a single slice of bread or a deli sandwich that's made with some of these various types of breads that people, quite frankly, can find yummy. But you've got to just be cautious about how much of the calories you're consuming are coming from these sort of fast food type breads, ultra processed ingredients going into these breads. Some of these ingredients are GMO ingredients, right? And here's a challenge with GMO. I understand the argument about some genetic modification making seeds grow more productively in, say, a drought-ridden area, right? And I don't know the details of that. I just know on the surface, right, that's sometimes the arguments that you hear. The problem is the microRNAs in these genetically modified seeds particularly, or other ingredients that you would find in bread or other common foods that we're eating, they actually penetrate your body at the cellular level. And they can impact the function of your actual gene expression. So epigenetics is a term that you hear used quite often. And so the challenge is, what are the risks associated with how those microRNAs are going to impact that gene expression? One, as the body gets older. Two, as the body might fight disease. What happens? What's the impact when men and women are having children, right? And that whole birth process. What's the impact of these chemicals and the gene expression process? And so for me, those are things that are concerning, right? And I don't want to find it in my bread. And I guess the low-hanging fruit to discuss is the artificial colors and flavors that you would find in some of these breads. It's quite different than, say, if your grandma used to make a bread and she put some olives in it, or she used olive oil instead of sesame seed oil, or these other sort of natural ingredients that may flavor, and not in a big way, but slightly flavor the bread that you're eating, or even something like, say, a cinnamon or a nutmeg or allspice or any of these things like this. Well, today, given the artificial sweeteners that are being used, colors and flavors, what we're really left with is a man-made product that's no different than the ultra-processed foods that we speak about all the time that are so concerning from a general cardiovascular health standpoint, risk of diabetes, ultimately the risk of cancer. And that's not to mention the fact that when you're buying these breads that aren't certified organic, now you've got to be concerned about the herbicides and pesticides that were utilized in the growing of the ingredients used in your bread. There was a study, oh golly Moses, I want to say 2 years ago, research that was reported in the UK, and they basically went around and tested commercially available breads in grocery stores. And here's what was really concerning: 60% of those breads that were tested, right, purchased at a commercially available grocery store, were found to be contaminated by pesticides. And so, you're innocently enough, right? You're buying this stuff for yourself and your family, and we don't realize that the volume level of pesticides and herbicides are also in those foods. And it's not, again, not trying to be an alarmist. It's not just a single slice of bread or maybe bread that you and your family eat for 1 week. It's just, what is the cumulative impact of these foods over time? Weeks, months, years of a diet that's dominated by ultra processed foods, including things like these breads that we're talking about. What does that do to your long-term survivability of sort of this modern life that we live, where there's chemical exposures and all kinds of things in the air and the water? And essentially what it does is it contributes to people's risk of disease. It contributes to inflammation, other things that lead to arthritis and other degenerative problems that people have as they get older, and it's impacting the quality and the integrity of people's lives. And so when we go on these shows and we talk about these issues, what we're really talking about, and while talking about ultra-processed breads may seem, maybe it's a little bit of a frivolous subject matter, what really we're talking about, though, are life or death issues and risk of disease, and learning to be a more discerning consumer, right? Paying attention to where these things come from, looking at the ingredient levels. I mean, there are choices out there, right? And so for all of us, looking for breads that are labeled and certified as organic. That's one way to make sure there's not all these chemicals, herbicides, and pesticides, because those things have been tested for in the process. I'm not saying that they're perfect. I've found plenty of organic products with higher levels of sugar in them than I want there to be, but generally it's coming from cane sugars and other sources like that, not high fructose corn syrup, certainly not sucralose or things of that kind. And so it's about you and I looking more carefully at the foods we're buying for our personal use and the foods we're buying for our family, and thinking about, if I'm buying these ultra-processed white breads, they're high in calorie, they're highly glycemic, they're going to raise somebody's blood sugar levels. So you got that high carb problem going on there. A lot of times they're filled with lectins. And lectins are basically compounds that you find in conventionally grown seeds that can lead to challenges with leaky gut, right? So there's just all kinds of reasons for us to think about it, because leaky gut, now you're talking about chronic inflammation and other even autoimmune diseases that can kind of come from that, associated with your gut and your bowel. And so I know for me, if I can avoid these white breads, that are sort of just, brimming with these glutens that can create all kinds of issues. And a lot of times these chemicals really lead to these food intolerances like gluten intolerance, where, you didn't find that years ago when individuals were consuming gluten that was just native to say stone ground flours. And so I realize, you start talking to a person about their bread and you can get in trouble with them real fast. And so I was a little hesitant for us to tackle this evening, but I just realized, as you look out there at what's happening, literally it's one of these cases where people are sort of eating themselves to death. And I don't say that lightly. These are big issues. Maybe they're not issues that show an overnight impact on your health, but over time they sure do. And so trying to make the best decisions and avoid these ultra processed breads. And that's not to say avoid bread completely. You just want to look for bread that doesn't have a whole lot of ingredients and sort of an artisan made bread, because that's the kind of bread that will provide nutrients and satisfaction without the downside of the other issues we spoke about.
Maybe because of this, what you told us, Eddie, when people want to lose weight, they say try to avoid eating bread, right?
That's right. That's completely it. And that's because When bread is ultra processed, its caloric count per ounce skyrockets. You know, you can take some of these native artisan breads, they might be heavy with seed or nuts or other things, and per ounce, their calorie count would be a third of what the calories would be if it was an ultra processed bread. So what they're really trying to say to you is avoid high glycemic starches and ultra processed breads and potatoes and pastas, because these ultra processed products raise your blood sugar so fast, and then that blood sugar is vulnerable to being turned into fat in your body. That's what happens with excess glucose. So when you eat that excess sugars in the food you're eating and it raises your blood glucose too fast, then your body will turn that actually into fat as a way to sequester it and manage it. Well, if you're trying to lose weight, that is not the recipe that you're looking for.
So the best way is to do your own bread, to prepare your own bread, and to find organic bread, right?
That's right. That's right. And you know, if a person likes to cook, right? I've been around some people that really make great bread, and they probably only use 3 or 4 or 5 ingredients, right? It's not that challenging, right? And so if you can make your own bread, or if not that, look for locally produced artisan breads with just a handful of ingredients, and it's a much safer and better choice for you and your family. And here, it's a chance for you to enjoy bread, because I love bread, right? I'm gonna always enjoy a little bit of bread, but I'm gonna make sure I enjoy the right kind of bread so I get the pleasure of it, but not the worry about the health impact.
But then some people say yeast in bread is not good too for your health or your. Is it true for that? Is it some yeast or something else?
Sometimes people will confuse yeast that's found natively in foods with yeast that's bad for your body. And there is a delicate balance here. Too much yeast from your diet can contribute to a yeast bloom in the body that the body can't deal with and manage. And so it leads to all kinds of gut health issues, all kinds of digestive issues. But generally that's coming from someone, or happening with someone, that's eating a diet that is just principally ultra processed foods. And so there's so much sugar in there that the sugar oversupplies. The sugar is essentially a source of food for that bad yeast in the body. And so that bad overgrowth of yeast that you find in the bowel and in the gut gets fed by all this sugar that's coming from a person's diet. And it's just really a terrible combination. In moderation, a good healthy yeast in a bread, or even an unfermented beer, is not going to be the problem that people have with yeast in general. It's going to be because they have a diet that has so much ultra processed food that their body is overgrown with yeast blooms, and they just simply can't manage it because of the volume of sugars that are coming from that ultra processed diet that's feeding those bad bacteria, those bad yeast bacteria. So there is a connection, but the connection is more about the volume of bad ultra processed food feeding the bad yeast than it is just the yeast itself.
Oh, Eddie, last week here in Thailand, we have news like mackerel, the fish, okay, that they have found the microplastic in fish. So, do you have anything to comment or to say about this?
Well, now, Pari, more and more you're reading about these microplastic fibers winding up in the food supply. And for all of us, it's probably not that difficult to think. Let's just think of, say, one source. More and more we're buying clothing that are made with plastic polymers, right? And this has been going on a long time, but now the amount of clothing that's made from these things is an even greater source. And I'm not even saying if that's good or bad, but here's one of the processes. As you would wash those clothes and dry those clothes and blow those dryers out into the air in the environment, and other ways these kind of processes happening, we're essentially putting these microplastic fibers everywhere in our world, right? It's airborne because it's lighter than the air molecules at some points, and sometimes it's in the water supply, it's in the soil. And so if you're growing plants, the fish that are feeding in the sea or the lakes and the rivers, they're going to be ingesting these plastic microfibers where their body doesn't break it down. If you or I eat plastic, the plastic comes through in our human waste. Our bodies won't break the plastic down. It literally at a micro level will be dispersed inside the fat in our body as a way for the body to try to manage that burden of plastics. And so that's what's happening with these fish. And, right now, I'm not sure what we could do to really completely stop that, except to try to look as much as possible as how we manage plastic waste and other industrial waste and processes that kind of spew this or atomize it into the air, because that's a very real issue. And it's not just with the mackerel fish. I'm sure as they dig deeper, you're going to find that a lot of the seafood supply has these fibrous microplastics in them.
So that we have to go to the source of the problem. The government has to do something from this, right, on this matter.
Yeah, it's just a question of, do they have the willingness and the will to do it, right? And at this point, it's such a large issue. How do you pull back? Plastic is such a integral part of our society, right? How do we pull back on that, trying to manage the impact it has on human health? And I have to say that's a pay grade way above mine. I'm not sure what the answers are, except that I know that it starts with human consciousness about it, right? Just realizing, hey, this is an issue to pay attention to, if not for me, for the generations of my family to come. So you want to be cautious. How much of a burden do you leave behind? That's one of the things I think about. There's a great Greek proverb that I use in one of my signature lines on my email that says, you can tell the quality of a society essentially by an old man's willingness to plant a tree that they will never sit under to enjoy the shade. That concept is about not just thinking about yourself today, but thinking about future generations tomorrow. I think that's where our environmental policies are going to need to go. We got to make some sacrifices today for what we will hope our kids and our grandkids would enjoy a better place.
Eddie, because you were mentioning that because of this fiber, microplastic fiber, the body cannot get rid of, right? So it's stored in the fat of the body. So we can do the detox, right, Eddie, to help our body at first place.
That's exactly right. So, one of the things I've had people say, well, gosh, I know people talk about nutrients, right? And the quality of your diet in that regard. And all of a sudden you're talking about detoxification. They're a little bit puzzled by that, right? Because it's not something they're, kind of consciously thinking about it. But in today's world, if you just consider the body burden associated with the modern life, just think of all the chemicals, in the air, the atmosphere, the water supply, the soil, and the food. Glyphosate, which comes from Roundup, is essentially in all the foods that we eat at some micro level. And what you got to hope is that it's not at such a level that's going to cause damage to your DNA. But just think about the compounding effect of that every meal you eat for every day and week and month and years to come, right? And so we believe it's very important to think about a strategy to encourage and help your body with detoxification. You can do that with your diet, a diet that's rich in fiber, green leafy vegetables, and whole fruits and vegetables, things that would encourage healthy bowel movements and just encourage waste to get out of the body. And then, of course, we believe deeply, as we've talked about on this show, of the use of zeolites, a natural mineral that encourages the body by binding with volatile organics, other positively charged particles that we don't want in our body system, heavy metals, environmental pollutants. And so I don't think we can ignore it anymore. I don't think you can take a passive position towards detoxification. You gotta take a proactive approach if the goal is to optimize health, which I certainly hope it is. I'm all about people reaching the full measure of their potential, and that includes their health. So, I want us to use all the tools we can, and I think you gotta have a detox strategy.
Yeah, it's not easy to live in the present time.
It's not easy, is it, Pari?
And even more difficult for the next generation, Eddie, if we don't change anything.
Well, that's right. And I feel guilt about that, right? I don't want to have used up more than a fair share of resources or left behind a mess that I'm not prepared to help them manage. And I worry about that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Eddie, for great information you share with us tonight.
Thank you, Pari. And folks, sorry to beat up your bread habits, but we got to talk about it.
Okay, Eddie, see you next time. Okay, thank you very much for today.
Next time, Pari. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.